Father Mark. Now, for those who are actually in Sparwood, they might wonder why I'm sitting in the photocopier cupboard, and the whole point is, no, if I can keep the dog in, I just wanted to show that we've got snow-covered mountains behind us, and it's a gorgeous day, and that's where we live. That is the place where we live. Ooh, there we go. So I've got a video to start with, so I'm going to do screen sharing. So that was a little introduction to where I live, and all those shots taken within the valley. Now, as you'll see from that, that Thumper runs and I meander. And some people walk with a purpose to get somewhere. I just walk and see where I end up. So if you're joining us for this talk and you're hoping to get somewhere, I think you might be a bit disappointed. But if you're here just to sort of have a little ramble, a little meander and see where we end up, then that's perhaps you'll be a bit more pleased with it. But our Lenten journey takes us from here to Easter, and I can't walk you that long journey. But what I can do is show you a bit of the journey that I have made, the journey that I've made in my life, and hopefully that will help you in your journey, not only to Easter, but going forward as part of a church. And this talk was prompted by, some time ago, I met an elderly gentleman. He must have been in his 90s. And I knew nothing about him when I met him, and I introduced myself as Father David. But I later learned that in the 1930, he must have been born, and he was a child during the war, which I think was quite significant to his sort of ongoing formation. And because immediately the war was over, he went off, I think, to junior seminary and then senior seminary. But he didn't get ordained a priest. He left to get married, and then was still very involved in the church. And because he had learned Latin at seminary and he knew all about the traditional rites of the church, and remember in the old days where the sort of one book had to be there and then you had to move it to there, and there was all these things going on, because he knew that so well. Then he was trained the altar service, and he was very involved in his church. But then Second Vatican Council came along, and I don't know what happened between him and his priest and what communications went on, but he was told, we're not having any of that. That is of no interest to us now. And he left the church, and he hasn't been back since. So, as I say, when I met him, I introduced myself as Father David, the Catholic priest, and he says, oh, are you married? And I said, no, Catholic priests can't get married. And he said, oh, they're still holding on to that, are they? And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because he clearly saw celibacy as an old-fashioned practice, and he was just waiting for the church to sort of dump it along with a number of its outdated doctrine and dogma and practices. And that was his expectation. And now that, as that sort of realization came to me, I was also reminded, this was 25 years ago when I was in St. Ives in Cornwall, and at the church there, I had been there for a bit, and one of my classmates from seminary and rang me, and he had left seminary and he had gone and worked for one of the national Catholic newspapers. I can't remember if it was the Herald or the Universe, but he said, look, I'm in a fix. I'm doing an article for next week and I need a straw poll. So he said, I'm ringing a number of you who I was at college with and asking, would you do sort of just whatever you can do, a straw poll? And there were 5 questions, and they were very simple and they were very down the line. Quite often with surveys, you can ask a question to sort of provoke a particular answer, but it was very straight questions. And so I put them out to a number of people, and I think I got something like 46 responses back. And it was about celibacy and about priesthood. And I was amazed that 2/3 of the responses said that they didn't value celibacy within the church, within their priests. And just slightly less than that said that if their son or their grandson showed an interest in going forward to the priesthood, then they would not give encouragement. And I thought, why have we got a vocations crisis if this was my parish? Now, I could imagine if you're a big parish and you have absolutely minimal interaction with your parish priest, or if this was a general survey of the population, perhaps these results would have been, but these were people I knew and people who knew me. And I thought, well, there is obviously a great gap there in understanding of priesthood, and very particularly of celibacy. And I must say that when I went forward for priesthood, celibacy was one of the anxieties that my mum in England had, that she worried about as I went forward. And I thought there might be people here, good Catholics, who also don't see the value of celibacy and its role in the life of the priest. So I thought, well, I've got Father Mark's given me this platform, so I'll actually have a little explore of this. Now, firstly, a definition of celibacy. Celibacy, now, I should say, in preparation for this, I've done some really good reading. So, theology, Karl Rahner, and celibacy is the formal and solemn oath to never enter the married state. Celibate men and women willingly relinquish their natural right to marriage in order to devote themselves completely and totally to God and his church. Now, I didn't actually get that from Karl Rahner. I got it much easier to read than Karl Rahner. Anyway, so why does the church hold onto this discipline? Now, I actually, in preparation for this, also got a Kindle book on celibacy and read that. It just goes on forever. And there's the history of it, there's the theology of it, the church's understanding of it, there's the scripture, what it says in the New Testament, there's what it says in the Old Testament. And that's obviously too big to include in a short talk like this. But I hopefully will touch on one or two of those areas. And I think a good starting point is the Old Testament, and to understand that in the Old Testament, that priesthood was hereditary. So we had Abraham, who was the first one, and then Abraham had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and Jacob had Levi, and then Levi had two grandsons, Moses and Aaron. Now, Moses was the prophet, Aaron became the priest, and those dual and separate roles. They also had Miriam as a daughter. But to be a priest in Israel, you had to be a descendant of Aaron. Now, obviously, if the priesthood is hereditary, that doesn't fit in particularly well with the idea of celibacy. Can you imagine if the royal family, which is another hereditary sort of institution, if they were all celibate, then there wouldn't be a next generation and there wouldn't be a royal family. Similarly with priesthood within the Jewish rite, if in Jesus's day, in Old Testament times, as it was hereditary, obviously celibacy wasn't, there wasn't a place for it. Now, I just can't resist being a little bit provocative from time to time, and this is sort of an aside, but it is an interesting I came across. Remember when Mary, the Holy Spirit appeared to Mary, and she was told that she would bear Jesus, and the first thing she did was went off to her kinswoman Elizabeth, and in a few verses before that, Elizabeth is described as a descendant of Aaron. And I wonder why Luke put that into his description of Elizabeth, because Elizabeth isn't the priest, it's Zachariah, her husband, who's the priest, parents of John the Baptist. And I just wonder whether Luke was in his mind having this idea that that Mary found that she was with child, and so she went to her priestly friend Elizabeth. And I say, I'm just stirring the pot slightly with that. Now, in Old Testament times, they didn't have celibacy, but they did have abstinence. Now, it's actually called continence. But I can't use the word incontinence because I think, well, what's the opposite of continence? It's incontinence. And I don't want to go there. I don't want to think about that. So, but this idea of continence or abstinence was very much not only for priests. It's not a particularly good example, but again, with John the Baptist's father, Zachariah, went up, was at the temple, and he was on duty. And it said at the time when his duty ends, he went back home. And it wasn't that it was a long way away. It was that during when they were on duty, they would shut themselves away from everything, and so that they could have this abstinence. And you might also remember that King David and one of his soldiers, Uriah the Hittite, King David was there, and warm evening, looked over, saw this very attractive Bathsheba on the rooftop opposite, and then things went on and he had his way with her. So King David called Uriah the Hittite back from battle so that he could be intimate with his wife, and so the fact that David had made her pregnant wouldn't be seen. That would be covered up. David's sin would be covered up. But Uriah then refused not only to have relations with the wife, but even to go into the house, because abstinence doesn't mean, well, when we're in bed, we shouldn't do this. It means you don't have any contact with the opposite sex. And I've actually experienced this in an odd sort of way. I've got had a very good friend, lost contact with him now, Belbir Singh Thind, and I was at university with him. And he was from India and Sikh religion, and he lived in the East End of London. And I went up and saw him, and I can tell you stories about Bill Beer and myself and the fun we had. And I would go to his house, and his mum didn't speak any English, but you would arrive, and he had his house, and then his cousins lived in the next house and the next house and the next house, and everyone was in and out of all each other's houses. And I'd arrived, and you'd be taken through to the back of a house, which would be the kitchen, and there'd be the kitchen table, and you sit there and you'd be given a cup of coffee. And it was all wonderful. And I then got ordained a priest, and the first time I turned up after my ordination, I went, and Bilbier's mum welcomed me at the door and then showed me into the front room and shut the door. And I sat there and I waited and I waited and I waited. And all this time, the kids were coming along and they were opening the door a little bit, peeping in, giggling and running away. And I was thinking, what in the world is happening here? So eventually I saw one of the kids that I recognized, an older girl. She must have been about 12. And I said to her, come in. And she said, no, I can't. I said, yes, I just want one word. Come on. I just want to ask you one question. I said, what's happening? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, normally I go through to the kitchen and have a cup of coffee. And now I've been put in the front room. And she said, well, you're a priest. And I said, well, okay, explain that a bit more. And she said, well, you're not allowed to meet women. And because there were no men in the house, they put me in the front room and shut the door because I'm a priest and they didn't want me to have contact with women. So anyway, so what we're saying about the Old Testament actually still applies in certain religions today, this idea of abstinence. And this is what Jesus was born into. He was born into this whole idea that while you're ministering as a priest, you then don't have any contact with females. And I think it's really interesting that at the beginning of John's Gospel, Jesus meets the woman at the well and has this interaction. And you can see the disciples very uncomfortable with this, because what they're trying to do is work out who Jesus is. And if Jesus is this priestly figure who they think he is, then what's he doing talking to this woman? And so Jesus is changing the understanding here of this. Now, we could say, well, when did Jesus exercise his priestly role? The function of a priest is to offer sacrifice. That's quite often the definition of priesthood, one who offers sacrifice. Well, he offered sacrifice on the cross, so perhaps that's when he was being priestly, but we'd say, no, his priesthood is greater than that. Anyway, at the foot of the cross, there were the women who traveled with him. And so we know that he wasn't cut off from women at that point. And then, well, perhaps when he was praying, but if he prayed at the Last Supper, there were women there as well. And clearly we would say that Christ was being a priest throughout his life. He didn't sort of do priestly things and then stop being a priest. He was a priest throughout his life. So abstinence wouldn't be possible for that role that he gave to us. So that says why he didn't practice abstinence, but it doesn't say why he practiced celibacy, why Jesus didn't get married. And I think there are two, well, there's more than two ways, but there's two I want to particularly focus on, two reasons for this that I particularly want to focus on. And one is that Christ clearly came as a prophet, and the Gospels present him as a prophet. And the Old Testament tradition is that a prophet lives his life, he lives his message. What he does in his life proclaims his message. And one of my favorite examples of this is Hosea and the prophet. And the word of the Lord came to Hosea: go, take for yourself a wife from whoredom. Take for your wife a prostitute, and have children from this prostitute. For the land, people of Israel, have committed prostitution against me. And what it was saying was that the people of God hadn't been faithful to their Lord and God. And they had started taking on other religions, other practices. And so that was equated to someone who's being married going with another husband. And so a whore, a prostitute. And so this prophet was told to go and marry a whore, Gomer. And he did, and bore a son through her. So the idea of living out the message that you bring. And what is the message that Jesus brought to us? The marriage of the Lamb has come. The bride has made herself ready. Book of Revelation: for the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. And the bride, Jesus is the bridegroom. We are the bride. People of God are the bride. And this is the message. Now, how does Jesus, if he went into an earthly sort of marriage, if he had married a particular person during his life, it wouldn't actually fit in with the message he was bringing. I think if, as a prophet, he would live out to the full the message he brought, and the message he brought is that he is the bridegroom, seeking out his bride, wanting to marry her. And that is, I think, a very powerful element of the way that Christ lived his life. But you might say, well, again, pre-resurrection and post-resurrection, well, perhaps they're different things, but I think one of the central things that Christ did was show us the continuity between this world and the next. And the second reason I think that Christ was celibate was because he was living by the values of the kingdom of God. He was living by the values of the kingdom of heaven, and that there was no discontinuity between the two. What he would do in heaven, he did on earth. And now, if in heaven he is there as a bridegroom, then how could he be on earth as someone already married? It doesn't work with his message. So I think, and now, why isn't he married in heaven? Well, because of this idea that his prophetic message is that he is the bridegroom, but also remember in Mark 12, the famous thing where the Sadducees come to question Jesus, and they say to him, there was a man who married a woman. He died childless, and the woman then married the brother, and then the other brother, and then the other brother, and married 7 brothers and never had any kids. In heaven, whose wife will she be? And Jesus answers them, for when they rise from the dead, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. And so there he is saying that the one marriage which will happen in heaven is a bridegroom to his bride, to the church, that we won't be marrying in church. We won't be giving ourselves in marriage or taking someone in marriage. And it's so the nature of the kingdom is not somewhere where Christ is going to be taking a specific wife, one person, as opposed to Christ as the bridegroom taking the whole church. And of course, the other thing is that if he did marry, then who would he marry? And one of the things that about the bridegroom in the whole story of Jesus is how unready and unfaithful we were. And then we get the whole role of Mary coming into the church. And that's, again, I could go on that, but that's with the time available, probably not. So that was why I think Christ was celibate. It fits with what he was doing. But why should Catholic priests then be celibate? Now, an obvious answer to that is that with the sacraments, the Eucharist takes a very central role with all the sacraments. And what is the Eucharist? It's the Last Supper made present again. But more than that, the Last Supper represented the great marriage. It's a foretaste of that great marriage feast in heaven, the marriage of the Lamb, the great celebration of the marriage of Christ to his church. That is what the great heavenly feast is. And the Eucharist is a foretaste of that. And so as the priest stands at the table, he is standing as the bridegroom, waiting to meet the bride. And so again, we have this idea that the priest stands at the altar and he too stands as a sign of the kingdom of God. Now, there are lots of signs of the kingdom of God. Why in the world should we just choose one particular one, celibacy, as a particularly important one? And I hope Father Mark is listening, that why shouldn't we say that all priests should have long hair and a beard? Or why shouldn't we say that all priests should wear bare feet, or at the most wear sandals? Or there's lots of other things. Why should priests be male? That would be another question to us. There are lots of characteristics of Christ, so why are we homing in on one? And for me, this then comes down to the practical, and I really don't like justifying celibacy by the practical side of it, because what my mom in England, her take on this would be that actually my dad in England, when he did his job, and he had a very difficult job at times, that he was better able to do it being married than if he had been single. And so there's not saying, oh, well, if you're married, that brings sort of all these disadvantages. That's not our understanding at all. That marriage is a wonderful thing, and hopefully you are stronger if you are married. But I remember when I was first ordained, I was in St. Mary's in Poole, another place that Father Mark has been. And I was there, and in my day, we were lucky that there were 2 and sometimes 3 priests in that parish. And so I was chaplain to the local hospital, and it was a very big and busy hospital, and I spent a lot of time in the hospital. And I was part of a chaplaincy team, which was led by the Anglican minister, who was Jane. Now this is 30 years ago now, and Jane was an incredible character. You know what a door looks like? Sort of big. I love Jane. She was wonderful, but she was really tall and she was really broad. I'm not saying she was fat, but she just had an incredibly big frame to her. And she would suddenly appear, you'd sort of see the door, and then the door would open, and there would be Jane filling that same space with a bright pink clerical shirt or a bright yellow clerical shirt. Now, this was 30 years ago, when the ordination of women within the Church of England was very new. And so it was sort of really quite a sight when Jane walked in, and I loved her dearly. She was a wonderful, wonderful person, but she was also a brilliant pastor. She had a softness of touch. She had a real gift for pastoral work, and I worked with her very closely. But I remember at one point we were both involved with a particular situation, and there was a wife who was very ill, and the husband. And one of them was Catholic and one of them was Anglican, and I can't remember which is which. And I think the wife might have been Anglican and the husband Catholic, but it could have been the other way around. But the wife was very ill, and we were there, And I can remember it was sort of coming towards the end of the day, and Jane was there, the nurse was there, the husband was there, I was there. And I looked at the husband and I said to him what I said to all the families I met in the hospital. I'd say, during the night, my response time is about 12 minutes. So if something happens, you just tell the nurse and I'll be here in about 12 minutes. And if nothing happens, you just tell the nurse and I'll be here in 12 minutes. If you want me, I'll be here. And I said it to everyone. I didn't think it was particularly special. And then I looked at Jane and I thought she was going to cry, because with all her heart, she wanted to say, and me, and me, and me, and I'll be here, I'll be here. But she had a husband and 2 children, and she knew she couldn't make that commitment because of the commitment to her family, that she couldn't go out in the evening without first checking that the husband would be there, that he didn't have a commitment, and couldn't, if it was early morning, come in the middle of the night, and perhaps it goes on to early morning, who's going to take kids to school? And if a husband has to do that, he's not going to get to work, and all the complications there. And I always say that the difference between myself and Jane was not our gender, but our marital status. And that, again, was sort of quite an important point in my understanding of celibacy. And once you've got that sort of understanding in your head, then you see all sorts of other things. And I'd go around the hospital, and again, I'm not having a downer on the Anglicans or any other churches at all within this, but the role of the chaplain tends to be functional. But for the Catholics, the role of a chaplain was relational. We came into relationship with people rather than performing a function for the people. And so I would go into a room with a family I had never met before, but I was a Catholic priest and I was there, and perhaps you'd have mother in the bed, ill, and you'd have all the kids around the bed, and there would be sort of a senior kid there holding a hand. I mean, these would all be adults. And then the priest would come in, and just naturally they'd move aside to let the priest in. And I would stand there as another of the children, because as a priest, we would go in and we would be another son, another brother, another father, because we would come in as relationship. The Anglicans, you could see, well, I've come to bring you communion. I've come to say a prayer with you. I've come to, and it would be much more functional. And what celibacy does is allow us to go more fully into that idea of relationship. Of course, the Anglicans come into relationship, particularly the people they know. But I think it is changed by the fact that we are celibate. And when I first came to Canada, I had the great privilege of being in a parish for 10 years without the bishop moving me. And after 10 years, you know everyone in the parish, and you're sort of going around and you know all sorts of things. And so I go into houses, and if it was meal times, they would say, oh, Father's here, lay another place. And it would just be an absolute natural thing, because you turned up, and so you were going to be fed because you were one of the family. You were in relationship with them. If at home I'd had another dining room table around which was a wife and kids, then there would have been a conflict there, that by inviting me to sit at their table, they're actually pulling me away from the other table where the father should be with his family, with his kids, with his wife. And so, again, you could see the great generosity of the Catholic community accepting me in as one of their family members. Now, I do have a whole list of things that I am not saying about celibacy, and not saying, and really it's just one, saying that there will be no marriage in heaven doesn't mean there won't be the love that married couples have in heaven. don't want to imply that at all, because that would be a very easy misunderstanding that we could make. And of course there'll be love. Those who know me know that I got two mums and two dads, and my mum and dad in England have both died. And we were around the bed of dad when he died, and mum and the kids, and we were all there. And 5 o'clock Monday morning, and dad, he'd had cancer, and he took his last breath. And I just remember looking at my mum and knowing that if you had pulled her arm out by the socket, it wouldn't have hurt as much as that moment. And when they're reunited in heaven, of course that love is going to be there. So we're not talking about heaven being a cold place or a place where there's no love. The definition of God is love, and so the definition of heaven will be a place of love, and it is going to be there in its fullness. But that love doesn't sort of imply our understanding that perhaps we have of marriage, because I very sadly lost my older sister a number of years ago. She was 53, and that still breaks my heart, and I still feel real pain over her death. And my hope and my prayer is that one day be able to restore that relationship of love that I had with my sister, and that separation that I'm experiencing now from her will be ended, and we'll be together again, and we'll be loving each other again as we did on earth. And so heaven is about love. Heaven is there, but celibacy very much, I think, is important within the church because it's a counter-cultural symbol. And it's interesting who gets quite almost upset or irate about celibacy, and those who are outside the church, particularly those who don't like the Catholic Church for whatever reason. Celibacy is one of the things that they quite often sort of will have a go at. So the celibacy is countercultural, because what are the gods of this world? What's the unholy trinity of this world? What value system does this world have that we're trying to be a counter-cultural symbol to? What are we trying to stand against? And it's that this world would say the important things. You could name other things, but I think these are three quite sort of prominent things: wealth, power, and sex. If you take in Britain, one of the tabloid newspapers, what is the headline? It's about wealth, it's about power, or it's about sex. And if you can get a good story which has got two or more of those, then you've got a story which will fill the front page, because they're the powerful, they are the things that have value in this world. Now, to that extent, the church, of course, in recent history, and I'm talking about a 2,000-year history, and so more recently, has had a lot of power. And you, particularly in East, talk to Eastern Europeans, and they would talk about that, but all over. And we're losing that, and that's an interesting sort of dynamic. And wealth within North America, Christian church hasn't had a good reputation. In North America, so many of the televangelists appear to be just after getting people to send them money. And we had, at the beginning of COVID, someone in London who was selling little vials of water, which he had blessed, so it would protect you against COVID, and he was selling them for £70. So, and anyway, that got stamped on. And so, but yeah, who from outside looks and doesn't, when they think of the Catholic Church, doesn't think that we've got a certain concentration on money, the collection of money. And so because there we had wealth, and we're seeking wealth, we had power and we've lost power and we want it. Well, then of course people say, well, yes, and of course you want sex, and sex must be in there, and we get all this. And I think that if as a church we would say, in fact, that we are going to take the emphasis off wealth, off money, we're not going to be sort of so focused on that. We're going to put ourselves in the hands of God and trust that either God will see us through, or we'll have to start selling things rapidly and God will show us another way. If we were to take the focus off wealth and then embrace an idea of servanthood, the church is servanthood. I think this is what Pope Francis is sort of very much part of his agenda, bringing the church back to a model of servanthood. Then I think celibacy would so naturally follow. But it's different from the ways of this world. And now because I saw the previous talk, I wanted to end with a quote from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I thought that's what we have to do when Father Mark is hosting something. We've got to. And this is a quote: God's gift puts our dreams to shame. And I believe truly that celibacy is a gift, and it has brought me things beyond my dreams. I did try to, I looked up the whole of that poem that she wrote, couldn't make head nor tail of it, but it was a nice last line to the poem. God's gifts put our best dreams to shame. So I don't know if there are going to be any questions, but I do have a little video that I'm going to show. And again, it's just nice pictures and nice music. And perhaps during this, if there are any questions, you can type them in, or be thinking about anything you might want to ask. So I shall once again go to screen share.